we're back. It's wonderful to be back with my son Dave, who is going to further instruct me in the inner inner mysteries of enaction, social enaction, and conversation. Because remember, folks, we are talking about real humans, even though artificial humans have leaked into our presentations, as you will see in a moment with Dave's wonderful slides. But I think we have to just keep exploring. We've had quite a few episodes, and there's always something new. And Dave, you're bringing it to us today.
Yeah, and this one is actually a part two from our last one we posted, which was on all about shame and social emotions and how they fit into language, especially focusing on my work with Professor Thomas Sheff, and and the reason we did that in the first place is because we got one comment from someone who was wondering whether enaction applies to therapy or a therapy process. And so this is the one where I actually finally get to that part that we didn't get to last time, because I have plenty of material on how shame and social emotions work. But the reason was that there I did come across an interesting therapeutic technique, but one that has a theory and approach that is compatible with the enaction ideas, but especially adds a new twist to shame and social relationships, the social bond theory that we've discussed last time. And it's a therapeutic technique that I've been doing myself for about a year, and it's very effective in itself, but it's also has a lot of neat ideas. It's been around for 40 years, but some of the materials on the relationship to shame and social emotions is new. So I'm going to do another big slideshow, and because watching the Olympics is a great time to generate all kinds of AI art. It's full of cool little images, but it will at least maybe show up okay on YouTube that way. And if we hide our image, turn off our video, I think we won't show up as little boxes on the screen. So let's see
Oh, yeah.
how that
No,
works.
just our names.
Oh, well, hopefully those won't be recorded. So in any
No.
case, so we'll see. There might be a part three, but what I wanted to really focus on was how social enaction really can focus on understanding what the self is, and especially the internal social systems of the self. They're not, enaction is kind of outward facing, focuses on conversation, real conversation, and how it works, and then how it brings forth social organization. But this is also bringing forth our internal organization, and the one that we developed with from childhood, learning languages and learning how to be members of the social world. So it turns out that the ideas can really fill out that as well. So I'm going to do, hopefully not too long, a review of the um, last podcast, which went into shame. And so it's hopefully at least a more concise version of that, and how social emotions evolved, and how shame domain is specialized for humans and managing the particularly human social relationships required, especially for language. And then I'll get into this internal family systems therapy technique, which is also kind of a theory in its own. This part three, we'll see consciousness. We could kind of use all of this to look at consciousness and self, and what it means to be kind of outward facing social inaction and inward facing social inaction, as kind of this idea of this Janus point, this two-faced God that looks in two directions at once to to bring forth who we are. So we'll see. That might be a third one, but we'll see how far we get.
I
Um,
love it. I love that idea,
yeah.
Janice. And I love it
So
all. So let's go.
let's go. So we're looking at just a review of how social actions enact social bonds and social self, and why um, how emotions matter for that. I always give just what do we mean by enact? I have a very particular definition um, where it's referring to the real live performance, especially of conversation, talk, social interaction, and how it's even just the mechanics of how mutual understandability is possible, how each of us become the audience of the other, but also the audience of our own voices. And what that does is brings forth the performance of talk, um, brings forth a domain of relevance in which talk is realized. But also this relies not just on this immediate mechanics, but what comes before it? How do we warrant this mutual understanding in what comes before? We didn't invent language and words. They had to come from somewhere. So how do we hold ourselves and each other accountable to what anyone ought to know for basic things, and what we have to work on to make specific meanings, and even relationships meaningful within the act itself? So with organizations as a starting point, we can build our theories from there. I always like to invoke the American pragmatist philosopher George Herbert Mead, because a lot of where you go next is looking at how acts, social acts in particular, are not just stimulus behavior, but he framed them as somewhat of a sequential but interwoven sequence of emotions of impulse at the beginning of initiating or interrupting acts, with perception coming next, finding out what's relevant, also predicting as part of perception, and then manipulation as the actual movements and behaviors that adjust to the world, and either fulfill our predictions or repair them, and then consummation being this final step of evaluation, sometimes resolving the emotional impulse that started from the act, but also as a place for learning, evaluating how well an act goes. And Mead emphasized this in particular as something that all animals from very early in the evolutionary phase of having brains and nervous systems had to develop for their social worlds, both the worlds of other animals, predators, but also their own families. Um, all of this being socially oriented, that still this impulse, particular impulses become relevant within species or within defining who's your uh, who's your prey and who's your predator, and where perceptions become socially defined sort of relevance. What counts, for example, as food has to be learned, and then how to have particular functions to behaviors that allow you to fulfill your perceptions and predictions and manipulation, and then the consummation, how are emotions resolved by social interaction. So I want to keep in mind that we're talking about acts. We're also talking about very particular communicative types of acts that many animals, certainly all mammals, share. Also birds, and well, really a lot of animals, where the calls, the gestures, the barks, the meows, the quacks, they become shortcuts. They're predictive of the acts that come afterwards, like the growl of the dog predicts the attack, and so the other dog can act on the basis of just the growl rather than the attack, and make adjustments. And this George Herbert Mead defines as meaning, the tendency or predictive aspect of the act, which becomes a defining thing. And emotions in this context become sustained through the act by kind of this relevance of meaning from impulse to consummation, and also through these predictive acts, you have kind of the self-other distinction, a reference for the act that's different than just, simple stimulus behavior. Again, it's something now that's been built up as with the meaning of other people's, other animals, gestures and symbols and acts. There's a distinction between what is it for myself to be distinguished as well from the social act. So this becomes the basis for um, building up more complex language among the the early primates that kind of evolved into where we are now. As these meanings become more symbolic, but I like to point out that at no point are emotions left behind um, as certain of us develop the capacity to have social acts become um, more mutual to the point where we might call something symbolic interaction. Just the symbols themselves become the stable recursive meaning reference points for social acts. The ability to hear your own voice is important there. It allows objects of reference to be emergent parts of interaction, and also accountability to that commonality of understanding. It's has to be there for this languaging to work, but it also becomes a constant reference for the quality of the relationship, which we're calling the quality and the need for the social bond for
Mm.
this more advanced method of interaction to work and to allow these early groups to survive, and is required then for the wider evolution of society, social organizations, each of which in turns expands the advantages of having a language. So, you know, jumped to where we are in evolution. Along with that comes this, what Mead is defining as the social self, along with language, becomes a more increasing distinction between what he calls two types, two kind of aspects of self, the I and the me, where the me is a social object. It's what's talked about. When you have language, you can now refer to yourself as an object in the same way you refer to others. It's referred to. But within that still is this I, this sense of subjective self-consciousness that's always there. Otherwise, I'm asleep or unconscious. As I'm awake and as I'm speaking, there's this integration of knowing who I am. So as one can talk about things, you can take the role of other people, specific other people, but also generalize others like teams and organizations or institutions like marriage. Um, but all around this are both the perpetuation and internalizing of these social expectations or norms by which who I am as an object fits into both the immediate social interaction and the society that I'm born into. On the other side, as I'm doing all this, I'm still feeling the I, which is expressed quite a bit as the feelings that occur within their socially enacted context. And a lot of these feelings are socially oriented, feelings about others' expectations of what I'm doing, how well I'm doing it. Am I fitting into the social norms and expectations? So the me, all these kind of socialized senses of who I am, become kind of both the filter for understanding the experience and the emotions of the I, but also the constraints of what how I can act. So kind of Freud's idea of the ego and superego. Um, but this is kind of a more refined and focused on the social interaction itself as enacting both two types, at least these two types of self, the I and the me. So
Mm.
so within this, I mean, that for years and years, even me didn't get too deeply into what's special about the emotions that support social organization of this sort. And in my early work, I caught on to these ideas that there are specialized social emotions, and they aren't simple emotions. They aren't the base emotions, but maybe something that evolved along with the capacity for human language as kind of a composite. And the idea of it being a composite is one you could, what I, some earlier podcasts with work of Dr. Mark Solms has a great kind of a model of consciousness with emotions at the core, but he talks and others talk about there being seven core emotions, kind of the base that lots of animals, certainly mammals, share, seeking anger. They're seeking kind of a curiosity, looking for food, looking for danger, anger, fear, lust in terms of like sexual desire that can, gets more involved with humans certainly, grief, which is kind of a separation, focus, fear, or panic, and then play is also as emotion. There's something special about joyful social interaction. So this idea of seven core emotions, you could find areas in the brain pretty well specialized for these sorts of things. But is there anything specialized for social emotions that really lights up? And probably it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be lots kind of a more general area. So that the idea of emotions kind of being merged and specialized into something that's more of a composite is there. I'm also going to re-invoke Dr. Ian McGilchrist because he pointed out and kind of consolidated in the best way of anyone the current literature and research on the hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left hemispheres, and their differentiation. And this differentiation has a lot to do with emotions and social emotions in particular, and also language. So that the left hemisphere is focused quite a lot on tasks of doing things, a task, making categories, analyzing, manipulating, controlling very the course of a particular acts. What we might call focus on the me part of the I, me, self, but also kind of can bypass feelings or kind of control feelings in that sense, is constraining. But the right hemisphere is much more oriented originally around what threats are sneaking up behind me as I'm focusing on my food, for example, broadening that context, always there, but also, as our reality becomes symbols and um, abstracted, portrayals of the environment of the human world, there's still this sense of this generalizing context, emotional kind of, and the kind of merging the feelings and emotions and even the social emotions like empathy or joy into the experience of the left hemisphere. So this is sort of this more eye brought focused hemisphere in this sense. So, and the corpus callosum that joins the two, um, it's not really fully integrating them. There's a real independence that you can see with these split brain studies that at least initially when if the corpus callosum were severed, you get two very distinct and independent selves who they sort of know each other exists, but they're very independent. Eventually that integrates better, but it suggests an idea we're going to bring up and focus on with this internal family systems theory. You can have more than one self inside of you, and maybe normally we do. And there's some complexity there that perhaps can be better explained by having much as we have an external world full of other real people, we have an internal world full of little people as well. So that's where we're going to get to. Just a little more on the summary. I'll try not to use up all our time on that, but I do want to make a very strong point that all emotions are communicative, even these raw ones like fear and anger. Within the mind, the emotions are kind of broadcasting from one part of the brain to the other, especially kind of a top-down assessment of the world, funnel down to like even the brain stem, making these little probably where the impulses are coming from, good, bad, threat, not threat, and then building actions that way. But with the social world, especially with language, there's lots of observation of other people's gestures and making our own. So you have the I experience and the me becomes um, um, they both co-evolve for talk, but still there's again this need for more of a composite emotion that's uniquely human, and this is where I bring in my work um, with one of my mentors, Tom Sheff, who he and his wife Suzanne Retzinger developed shame and social bond theory, uh, where they were drawing from work in the 70s and 80s on sociological social psychology, but family systems theory, bringing in therapy approaches, which was unusual for sociologists for sure, and psychotherapy, focus on shame and guilt. Uh, like researcher Helen Block, psychotherapist and researcher Helen Block Lewis. Back then, there was little research on shame and guilt. Still is relatively little research and theory on what shame and guilt and these embarrassment, these other emotions are, and whether they're special for human beings. So that's what I certainly argued in detail during the last um, um, podcasts on this special nature of the shame family. The shame family is what, um, for lack of a better term, we're focusing on this specialized composite of social emotions that may be mostly unique to humans, and in lesser forms, maybe with the other primates, but it's really focusing on a certain dynamic, a shift in closeness and distance between yourself and other in a social interaction, but also kind of more symbolically, and also the quality of the relationship that you're maintaining, either directly or symbolically, relationship talked about. This dynamic is what is something that kind of draws together all these different raw emotions, each kind of contributing to something that has both a social context and a self experience. So fear of rejection from the family or the tribe becomes a felt anxiety of removal from social safety, grief in its own. You feel sorrow for those rejected or reject you, kind of felt loss of security, despair, the despair of like perhaps never being accepted back to the family or the tribe becomes this kind of a hiding sensation or feeling. Anger is a way of bypassing some of that pain and feeling by rejecting those who reject you, rage being one way of doing this, and disgust. Something about like the disgust for foods becomes a disgust towards social others, a stigma, a stereotype, either of people you are shaming or people who shame you. You feeling that distaste around the rejected bonds of others and self. The argument is all of these are blended together into this shame family, in which you get something special, particularly around this context of the social relationship or social bond. And you see this coming up in language. Accountable errors of acts and speech become threats. Violations of social roles, not conforming to the group or expectations, become a threat to the relationship. Shifts in power, hierarchy, order, very much relied on for complex organizations. But even little micro events of disrespect, respect and disrespect for others, moral judgments, stigmas, or even an erosion of norms within a community becomes a more global threat to one's experience of social relationships, how one does it with others. This is what keeps, language and also society going. So why not have specialized emotions around that? So what you see is some specialized gestures, visual cues, um, that some of which are kind of overt, like hiding, blushing, covering the face, having a nervous giggle. These are these are rather specialized, I think, to this family of shame, but also inwardly as a pain is something that people will bypass. And in bypassing or suppressing, they'll show things like disruption of speech, jerky motions, dissociative thoughts, or anger and rage towards those who shame you. All of these become kind of overt specialized signals for this composite family of events. So within the shame family, there are different contexts and then different names we commonly use. So embarrassment is kind of the lightest form of the shame family, where you kind of come up with a transgression that could happen to anyone, such as you might overtly blush. Laughter kind of invites other people to adjust and maybe recognize their role in similar situations and repair the relationship. Um, Guilt is another one where there might be something that you did, a transgression, but something that seems repairable. Like if you acknowledge your guilt, you might have a better opportunities for others to come along and help you feel better about it. So where the bond threat is repairable, you kind of relies on empathy, concern for others, mutual acknowledgement of feelings, and mutual urge to repair the relationship. So it's very functional, especially kind of for both families, societies, and other social organizations to have these types of emotions. Shame gets to be it's functional, but it can become kind of personally and even socially dysfunctional, where there's more of this threat for a bond that can't be repaired, a relationship that can't be repaired between the shamer and those being shamed. Um, where the shamer can be an individual or a generalized other, like society that has declared you to be in some stigmatized group, and then feeling shame. So the sense of being ashamed, and both of them are actions, being ashamed and shaming others. So being ashamed is to identify with the transgression. I am someone who does this shameful thing, being wrong, and this hiding gesture becomes part of it. And then shaming others becomes a way of um, both using shame for kind of a social power, but also a way of perhaps bypassing your own role in a troubled relationship, showing disrespect for others, global judgments for others' acts, pointing out stigmas, emphasizing different social status, and anger and rage becomes a way of rejecting the rejectors. Um, Now, on the other side of this, there's a positive side of a secure social bond, which we call pride, the pride family. But it's really, pride may not be the best word. It's again, it's kind of this composite of joy of securely, having a repaired bond. It has gestures of smiles and laughter and eye contact. Um, Play becomes a factor. Respect for complying to social rules, builds self-esteem, sense of purpose. Um, Love, the real changing of just raw lust into love, for a family, for bonds, for the tribe, for solidarity and feelings of peace and broader security in that sense, and then kind of a satisfaction, all of which just in maintaining secure relationships, even if they're power or hierarchy relationships, feelings of respect or gratitude, all of those can kind of be glommed into this general concept of pride. So shame on one, well, shame family for the negative, distant bond, pride family for bond repair, secure bonds. This is the dynamic we're talking about. Um, I keep forgetting to advance my slides. I did all these nice graphics on the YouTube. So anyway, this is getting to be too much of a review, but maybe it's still worthwhile to talk about the bond threat sequence, because it is something that we'll focus on what it means. Then this is really my research I did, especially for my master's degree, looking at a particular sequence of activity, starting from the orientation to the bond threat. There's a trouble to the bond. it stimulates, or as an impulse, a shame family, something from the shame family, embarrassment, grief, or shame, and then an effort to adjust to the social bond. This happens in a sequence that you can see people doing, blushing, touching the face, having a nervous, having a nervous laugh. Um, or people can orient to the bond threat and do something to bypass the shame, um, by stuttering, stammering, anger, shaming others. That's also a way to adjust the social bond. So you're either repairing the social bond or maybe justifying the distance of the social bond by this sequence of acts. Um, and last time I showed an example where this has already taken hopelessly long review, so I won't do it. But you can see uh, people doing this by close analysis of their interaction of
We are in a way like the way we
of orienting to, even when they're talking about a troubled relationship, they'll experience and show these emotional gestures as they occur and talk about it, and then do something even symbolically to say, well, this isn't as big a problem as I thought, or acknowledging perhaps that there is a trouble with the bond and perhaps telling the story of how it was resolved. Um, so it's something talked about,
totally.
and it's something that is also immediately experienced. And this immediate experience of the shame family is really something that precedes language. It's something that as soon as the baby's born, and not long after, you'll see infants and the mother or the caretakers have sequences of looking and looking away, of bond connection, bond distance, bond repair, and other gestures, the smiles, the prosody, the vocal stance that even precede a child learning language. It's a way of building kind of the relationship basis of having a mutual understanding, um, and achieving that and knowing what it feels like to achieve that. This is required for talk. Conversation requires a relationship. And we talk about relationships all the time. Almost every sentence, you can find some sort of ways that people are adjusting, assessing, possibly repairing the quality of the relationship as they talk, because it's in those social contexts that you're warranting that quality of the social bonds. Um, and what it is that counts for defining that accountability precedes talk. It's what we learned, it's what we were socialized to, is developed as children. So, but I make a stronger claim. I say that social bonds really may be this existential sense of the self, enacting the I, me through self. When it fails um, fully, in a sense, you no longer exist. Um, it's not just you don't understand people, but you don't even exist as someone who can understand people if you didn't have some sort of a warning that's a little bit deeper than just cognitive dissonance or garbled speech. But there's something that's there to keep those boundaries intact, and even the broader boundaries of this, for example, accountability, of saying things that other people ought to understand. So this shame pride dynamic maintains a social group and social group life as what we've been calling enacted social action. So if you got tired of listening to the last talk, now spent half our time uh, at least summarizing more concisely what we meant. But I do want to at least get through the next part, which was all this leading to what is it if we turn this understanding of our orientation to the external world as managing quality of relationships through talk and other social actions, and the feelings that we feel that are specialized for this maintenance internally. Yes, the self might be enacted as I and me, but is there more to it? And I think there is because there's a large industry called psychotherapy or therapeutic psychology that helps us deal with our internal worlds where it's not just because of problems with our speech that we feel depressed or anxious or angry or all the other complexes we grow up with. It's something going on inside that seems to be sustaining this beyond a given conversation that really um, makes us certainly different personalities, but perhaps less functional than we might wish to be. That's where therapy uh, can come in. Um, so the premise here is the bond threat simply between the self, this I, me self, and other people, other individuals, other groups. Um, Certainly we see social bonds as requiring, this co-presence, but also something you could talk about in the sense of generalized other, our orientation to groups, organizations, institutions such as education or social norms, such as politeness, um, uh, where if the other, we orient to all these different kinds of others, real people, generalized people, groups, organizations like work, the workplace. If there are all these multiple distinct I, me selves that handle the complex social world, perhaps there's internal selves that do all this differentiation and make all these external others be sorted out, kind of specialized. So in this, we see, I think, where this internal world starts to break down, he kind of can and perhaps become problematic, is where you can see perhaps how much we rely on this inner world of perhaps multiple source selves managing external social bonds, but perhaps there are internal social bonds within ourselves. So what does this mean? If you look at child behavior, what you'll see is ideally you're born into a world of secure social parental bonds where the parents help manage the distress, your fear, your anger, just the complexity of the world that you're growing into. And as you grow up, this relationship management becomes more complex as the threats and difficulties of the world become more complex, and bringing in more of these composite shame family feelings just to deal with it. So we develop this capacity, but along with it are methods of dealing with bond threats in more complex ways. From something like the parents being held, a little more harsh or having to say no to some of our behaviors towards our peer groups, where it becomes much more complex, and where we could start to learn perhaps our strategies for dealing with our parents don't work with our little friends. Bond threat strategies start to fail, and perhaps they fail persistently, and perhaps that becomes traumatic. What does this mean? It becomes where our internal I, me parts are there, basically broken. Basically think of it this way. No, there's not one self, the I, me, but there are parts perhaps that can break up to resolve in a more compartmentalized ways what would be otherwise an overwhelming shame, an overwhelming risk of just kind of falling apart if you only had one strategy for life. Um, so the idea is perhaps by having more internal parts of ourselves, we have an ability to create internally secure bonds amongst parts of ourselves. And this is a strategy for how we survive in a complex social world. It's the evolutionary development that came along with language, for example. But this is done perhaps with varying degrees of success at different maturity levels. So let's see how this works. Where are we coming from? This idea of internal family systems therapy was developed, I think, over 40 years ago by Dr. Richard Schwartz. He was originally trained in external family systems therapy. Family systems therapy has been around for a while. Basically, you don't treat the individual, but you bring in their family. You look at their social bonds and relationships. You try to balance them out, find out what's not going right. And that's pretty effective, but he was finding it wasn't always effective. Sometimes it wasn't never fully effective, especially at fixing the internal bonds that some of his clients would experience. So someone would have like an eating disorder, and they, he brings it in. Everyone in the family is all oriented around making it work, and yet the person still feels there's something in them that's just wrong and just there, like a little entity that's making them um, have anorexic behavior.
Mm.
So what he found is that it's not just working on these external relationships to eliminate some bad behavior or bad emotional response. You have to maybe look at what's going on inside, and maybe there's more than one person inside. And it's not just multiple personality disorder, which was around before that, but maybe the capacity to have different aspects of ourselves are actually there, parts of selves, little entities within us. And you have to acknowledge the relationship between those entities. And perhaps those entities have an ex relationships that have to be dealt with conversationally. What he found is that the little parts within us can converse, they can talk, they can interact with the therapist, and therefore they can interact within yourself. In a way that you don't always hear, but in a therapeutic setting, you actually start hearing it. This is the crazy thing about this therapy. You start to realize that these kind of sub-personalities roughly can and do interact socially with each other. And they communicate. They communicate with images. They communicate with gestures. They communicate especially with feelings, and even conversely. So you get this idea that there must be within us lots of distinct entities, I, me entities that are sustaining distinct emotional and situational relevance for particular acts, particular objects, particular relationships, particular feelings, particular situations that we grew up developing things, and each part still wants something positive for the individual. It's not just there to attack us. It's there for a reason. But the reasons that they're there and the methods don't always work well because, like any social organization, someone gets the idea of something working well, but it doesn't necessarily work that well for the rest of the organization, including very extreme behaviors like anorexia or suicide or other addictions. Even these are parts wanting something positive for the individual. So Richard Schwartz was really dug into what this meant, and the therapy's been quite popular and effective. But let's look at what this means for the self. What is it that makes parts? And what it seems to be are overwhelming bond threats, social bond threats in particular, during childhood development, problems with the relationship. So the child normally differentiates as they grow from the basic maternal parental bonds to siblings, and then other peer groups, and then into more generalized bonds. But in early life, events damaging or traumatic to bonds to various degrees can invoke painful feelings correspondingly. So there's a little scenario that you can see on YouTube where like a little child living near a busy street, is always playing and then running out into the road in front of busy cars. And of course, the mother is going to get scared and scold the kid, don't run out into the street. And the child, maybe this happens once, maybe it happens many times, very scary for the child. The mother is always saying, I've told you this a million times, don't run out into the street. Now, Normally, ideally, and often, this may say, okay, but after this, the mother might restore a secure bond. The child, okay, you understand. Now we're going to look at how to cross the street, and then the child learns to self-soothe after, the parents help. Eventually, the child kind of carries within them kind of an older self who now helps them cross the street and not get scared about crossing the street and not so so there's kind of this idea of internal parts taking on protective roles that their parents might take on originally and internalizing it. But it's not just like an abstract concept. It's a real little self in there taking care of you. Um,
Hmm.
but let's say the mother isn't all that great at resolving and taking that next step of repairing the bond and just yells at the kid every damn time. That kid starts to think, well, there isn't really a repair happening. I've got to self-soothe some other way. Let's come up. I'm 3 years old. I'm 5 years old. My solution is cars are scary. Cars are scary. Don't go near the road. Be afraid of cars all the time. This is my solution. So this part that says cars are scary becomes a protector, a protecting part. It takes on protector roles. It was a great solution for when you're 3 years old. The problem is it could stay there as a solution as you grow up and you don't even know why. So the boy grows up, and there's still, for some reason, he's crossing the road, and it's like they're scary cars. There's a part that's taking care of this scary park car. I don't even know it's there. I just kind of feel nervous when I cross the road. And in this sense, these parts that developed in young age can stay with you as kind of burdens, what they call burdens, extreme beliefs, emotions, fantasies that can become dysfunctional. So the boy grows up, for some reason he gets to the point where where his friends are learning to drive, but he still feels this uh, hesitancy around driving. Sometimes he might kind of get this sense of, well, cars are scary, but other times maybe he doesn't even know why. He thinks of going to driving school and just can't do it. So
Yeah.
as you grow up to adults, you start having these parts that come to limit the choices you can make, the options in life. Maybe he's facing social stigma. His friends are laughing at him because he's afraid of learning to drive. So these, what they call exiled parts, parts that are really feeling the pain are kind of dug down so you don't even know they're there. But they're
Hmm.
they're there. They're trying to do something protective, but they're still there and you don't know why. In a lot of cases, we grow up knowing exactly why we were, if we had abusive childhoods, you could really pinpoint what the trouble is. And certainly this internal family systems can focus on that. But there's a lot of things where, um, some of the books talk about these cases where someone, they had something their whole life that just made them feel scared. But it was like some one event from early childhood that the
Hmm.
5-year-old interpreted one way, but an adult would never interpret that way. And yet the 5-year-old's interpretation was still there, kind of defining how they face life. So just some of the terminology that this internal family systems or IFS uses. There are different types of especially these protector parts, these roles, these parts having roles in protecting other parts from mostly past trauma. So the parts with the past trauma are the exiles. They hold the pain, but often they're suppressed. They've been kind of pushed away by the protective parts, but they're still desperate to be heard. They want their problems solved and helped, but kind of they're in this internal social organization where no one's listening to them. A lot of what's happening is these managers are kind of in control of your daily life. They're proactively preventing you from feeling this pain. They become kind of the critics, our internal critics, our internal perfectionists, our internal worriers who worry about everything, in order to keep us from those places where the exiles are being triggered or going to feel the deeper pain. And then beyond that are called firefighters. These are the ones that really come up especially in immediate situations, to react often very impulsively to suppress and crush down those exiles and their pain. These become kind of the hiding behaviors, the real immediate uh, things like rage, dissociation, but even extreme behaviors like addictive behaviors are kind of firefighter methods. Um, so what the therapy, IFS therapy does is it's looking at how we can unburden these parts and return to a natural balance. And the way this is done, I'll kind of go back into this again, is basically the therapist facilitates the client's respectful conversation with parts. And respectful conversation is key. It's not just, okay, we've identified the bad firefighter, we're going to make him go away. No, the firefighter's there for a reason. So talk to each one as though they're people, as though they can be treated with respect. And what they find is that these parts will actually speak, often speak with their own voice, with their own imagery, felt in different parts of the body. And I've experienced this. It's like these little phrases like, okay, you felt this way about like going to school. You started second grade and had to go to a new school, and it seems like there's a part that was involved. And then what 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 was that like? And then there's a little part that kind of sits, and it's like it's in my belly, and it says, I felt this way. So so the therapist talks to this part that's protecting the little boy who's afraid of cars. The part says, he can't be on the street alone. That's why I'm doing this. And the little boy who's being protected says, "See, no, this part stops scary cars. This is good. This is why it's here." You hear these voices, and it's like, my God, am I going nuts? No, it's actually helping. So it's a fascinating experience, and
Mm.
it's very effective because what you find is that through this dialogue, the parts themselves start to figure out what's the non-extreme, first, why, what we're protecting in the first place, and what's a non-extreme method of doing this, of conveying to like these younger parts how they might be protected better than your 5-year-old self figured out, if an adult self figures out a better way. And what it rather than having these exile parts operate in isolation, they just being felt that they can be heard, say what they need. It helps the managers calm down and the firefighters calm down so they don't have to be kind of just controlling, but can actually come up with better solutions. So it's very much a dialogue process. It's a felt process, and clearly it's a very social process. And that's, when I heard about it, it's like, oh, social emotions. What can that mean? Um, another important aspect of this is that what uh, um, uh, Dick Schwartz found is that there's something there beyond these little protector parts. There's something that ended up calling the self, or self energy. There's always some sort of a core self, even for patients that had the most terrible abuse. There was still something that was there that was um, not harmed and could become kind of the trusted leader or organizer of the internal family system.
Mm.
And so, excuse me. So, what they call the self, or sometimes self energy, it becomes a leader in the sense that, like a conversation among family, there could be kind of once you have parts, the protectors that aren't dominating the conversation with their needs, you get a more balanced kind of I me sense that can kind of lead and organize the conversation parts and really provide a more secure bond. And what this self voice has, Dick Schwartz had kind of narrowed down eight C's, using the letter C for foundational qualities. This voice or self was more calm, had more clarity, curiosity and confidence and courage and creativity and compassion and connectedness, was able to express this. And when it does, that really gets you progressing in the therapeutic process. But it suggests there's something special going on when you have this integration of parts. So the question is, what's happening? And it seems to be that um, this special sort of I self is leading these different me's, the social objects and their expression differently when perhaps this internal set of social bonds are more secure.
Mm.
That's what it seemed to me. So, what does it mean when social bonds are secure? It suggests that in those parts, they're dealing with this shame family of emotions. And it turns out I wasn't the first person to think about it because of one of the uh, a long-term practitioner of internal family systems, Dr. Martha Sweezy, who's teaches at Harvard University. She thought of this first and wrote a great book integrating IFS theory with shame and guilt. So she says the book is called Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt. So in the time that we don't have, I want to at least go through this, and maybe we'll do a part three, because
Mhm.
what I found after looking at this book and also doing the therapy is that there's an important extension to Thomas Sheff's approach to social bond. Excuse me, with Tom Sheff, we never quite figured out what it is to like, excuse me, um, to acknowledge shame, adjust the social bond. What is it? How does it work? All right, longer pause for coffee. You might have to cut back. But uh, if we look at the family dynamics in terms of this, both the external social others, but also the internal family of parts being adjusted, we learn something new. And so, what does this look like? You could clearly see how it's really the shame family of emotions that are creating parts in the first place.
Mhm.
IFS theory, they talk about pain. They say, oh, the pain of emotions. Well, what is this pain? If you really look at what they're saying, it's almost always from bond threat. Thus, it's probably this composite shame family of emotions that we're dealing with. It's not pain like physical pain. It's not pure anger, it's not pure fear. It starts with shame. And shame can be resolved by repairing bonds with others. So where external bond repair fails, the child creates parts as a new internal bonds and tries to come up with a secure internal bond.
Mm.
So this is the basic idea, and Dr. Sweezy differentiates shame and guilt in this way by the types of threats and the types of repair methods of the parts. So, um, so guilt. Guilt is can be framed as kind of assessment of behavior for an accountable transgression. So I did something wrong. Um, this the guilt feeling is kind of earmarked by a repairable social bond, especially interpersonally. So I feel guilt. I signal my accountability and my willingness to repair the bond. And ideally, with others, we could do something adaptive with mutual acknowledgement of the to secure the bond, repair the bond. But if someone out there isn't able to do that right then, ideally, I'll have internal parts that can maybe help um, repair the bond. But basically, acknowledging the accountability, just doing so may be more bearable internally, even if the bond's not fully repaired by feeling guilt, knowing at least internally that I feel bad for some transgression, social transgression. But guilt, of course, can become maladaptive if
Mm.
especially if this transgression starts to define self, this feeling of not just doing something bad, but being bad, or even feeling guilt that or feeling that I benefit from another's expense, using other people's guilt to my benefit becomes fused with shame. Shame, feeling shame myself or shaming other people. So shame is really this kind of action that in the outer world, you can feel shame or you can be the shamer. And this is done internally as well by parts. One part does the shaming, as one or more parts does the shaming as acts of judgment um, of an insecure bond, and other parts feel shameful, a state of being. So so especially these protector parts, or may may find it important to condemn the part, one part's for another part's transgressions. Um, you are a bad boy for running across the street rather than you're bad for running across the street. And another part starts feeling shameful. I'm the recipient of the shame. Um, I may feel the hurt, or bypass it with blaming or showing kind of a false pride, or believe the message. And this might become a recurrent feeling of low self-worth, confirming prior negative beliefs. So part of me is making the judgment. The other part is confirming this negative belief. And this becomes a self-sustaining kind of internal conversation that one can develop as a solution early in life and then grow up with. So, a bond threat, um, then, the way to adjust the bond threats may depend on different aspects of, like, what's the context, what's the vulnerability level, uh, personally, or depending on socialization, different contexts. The ashamed person may either accept the shaming, feel the shame, feel the embarrassment, the hiding, the withdrawing, or reject feeling shameful by these bypassing actions and thoughts. Um, this becomes seen more clearly with this concept of the protector types, the firefighters and the managers. So the firefighter protector parts can build up to become immediately reactive to the experience. As soon as you feel shame, they're jumping in, and they're going to come up with um, other emotions. What I think, especially these non-shame emotions, used to bypass this more complex feeling of shame, or like the anxiety of shame. In other words, a firefighter might use fear, raw feelings of fear, to hide away that much more effectively from what was a shameful experience, or anger, rage, to bypass the feeling. Of or the more mild forms of blushing and hiding become also kind of these immediate gestural experiences that we'll see in life, um, or these other bypassing actions such as verbal destruction, despair, disgust, or showing false pride. Oh, that doesn't bother me. It's all your problem. As kind of the firefighters' immediate solutions to the feelings of shame. And these are all kind of the parts that grow up to do this role. But then you'll have the managers are kind of the more complex and organized ways of managing even the firefighters themselves. You really don't want the firefighters jumping up all the time so that something goes wrong in the office and you're just screaming at someone. No, the
Mhm.
manager is there acting proactively, often before the shame can be even felt. You're not even going to
Mhm.
get to the point where you feel shame or embarrassment because it's doing something internally and predictively to repair those internal bonds that are getting triggered by doing something else, like dissociating that offended part from external others. It's like, oh, well, say something, change the topic, say something complimentary to another person, act as the inner critic of the parts. Oh, well, yeah, I'm always worried about that, but that's just because I'm an idiot. Um, so, um, or, instead of feeling the shame, you conform to the opposite of the shame. You know, uh, Kids are picking on you. Well, I'm going to also agree that picking on a kid for this reason is good, and I'll pick on other kids as well. So the manager is kind of building up emotion neutral ways of dealing with these parts, but still, you still have these exiles that are being formed. These parts of self that have resolved shame by just hiding away from all the other parts. They're just gone. You don't even know they're there. Uh, they will potentially feel shame to the point where they would um, not just feel shame, but feel this despair. Like I am just complete. I'm so separated from the group, the external group, but also my inner parts that I'm at the feeling like I could die, like myself will disappear. Um,
Mhm.
and sometimes within these exiles, experiencing this pain, other protectors might use suicide or suicidal thoughts as a solution to this deep pain that an exile might feel. So it's not just like depression, the exile is depressed. It's like a protector is using depression as a way of muting the more extreme pain that this exile may have developed as an unresolved social bond
Mhm.
experience somewhere in life. Um, so a lesser form of this is the bypassing behaviors, perhaps using this bypassing of shame helps at least recoup this, draws you back from these exile parts, recoups that balance, distracts the inner critics. You could use it, but shaming other people might distract your inner critic. Conforming to others helps distract these inner critics and managers. So, in a way, you could see how social power and even social status can be balanced by our parts and their effects of managing shame. Um,
Mhm.
in the larger scheme, because of this, we have social organizations that kind of click along. But most of your podcasts are people in the business world seeing that a lot of leaders' strategies are little expressions of parts that are dealing with shame poorly,
Yeah,
or
it
entire
could be. Yeah.
organizations built
Yeah.
upon bad shame management.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it's a real connection there, perhaps.
Mhm.
So just to kind of uh, round things up, what I like to do is talk about how where my master thesis looked at a more simple kind of external bond threat sequence of people or as they talk orienting to a bond threat, showing some indication that they feel shame or at least are fighting to bypass shame, and then doing something about the bond to reorient it to either repair the bond or perhaps justify the distance of the bond. This is an external kind of enacted conversational domain expression of what I call the bond threat sequence. Adding Dr. Sweezy's work in particular, we can now add a much more um, complex but thorough internal world activity as well. Um, so she describes how this threat sequence works in 6 acts. The first act would be the injury, especially early in life. The caretaker or authority figure shames a child for an unintended act, but it's one that remains in the split part of the child as kind of the bad thing that the child did, running across the road remains, it wasn't intended to get in trouble, but now it remains as the part that says cars are dangerous and bad. And that becomes kind of a focal point of shame. But part of that is you're accepting this shame part. You have to accept this belief: I am bad. I am the bad boy who runs across the street. There's some little part of me that's defective, that's worthless, that's either too much, too little, various ways of defining the self around these uh, unrepairable social bond elements. Um, the next act is instrumental shaming by the critical parts. As these managers develop, there's parts of you that say, I agree, that's true, you are bad. The managers are there proactively shaming the child part that's being ashamed to make it better or keep it safely hidden, to make yourself at least functional in the world. That okay, I something about the streets and cars makes me scared, so I'm gonna ride the bus. But as you do actions that themselves become stigmatized, I never learned to drive. I'm always on the bus. My friends start to laugh at me because I'm always on the bus. There's becomes more proactive scout managers are out there looking for those social situations. So don't let your friends see you getting on the bus. Try to bypass those feelings, but through prevention acts, either hiding more or perhaps the next act bypassing by saying, hey, I'm not bad, you are. The firefighters come out, they shame other people uh, for as a way of not to feel that internal shame. And so you start getting these more antisocial behaviors externally, which are only there for pro-social internal parts. You're trying to protect your internal parts, but at the cost of your external world, where you're yelling at your friends and not having friends anymore because they're making fun of you for not driving. Um,
Mm.
and then the Act 6, when it really gets bad, in comes the rescue teams. These are parts that make you feel better at any cost. Uh, the more shame you feel, the more self-serving, distracting things, numbing behavior you might have, like drinking or other addictions, just become ways of persistently keeping these exiled parts at bay, which are all kind of shame-based. So, um, if you're lucky enough to find a internal family system therapist, and there's plenty of them, it's a very common training among people. You usually find somewhere in larger towns. What they're doing is they're having that conversation in which they're getting that broader self to acknowledge the shame and the persistent troubles amongst these parts and their internal social bonds, um, and try to lead the conversation into more of an internal family system of mutual respect, esteem, worth, pride, love, um, as the dominant way that we deal with our troubles in the world, so that we become uh, more functional, deal with our problems. So usually it's the kind of there's a manager part in us that recognizes that, boy, my life, something wrong with my life. I got to go to therapy. So going to therapy becomes kind of initially protection, where I want to fix and improve these damaged parts. I'm convinced that there's something wrong with me. So therapy is going to fix it and get rid of these shameful parts of these uncontrolled firefighters that are making my life miserable. So part of what the therapist does is train someone as what are internal family systems. We're going to treat these parts not as something to get rid of, but as something to respect. Respect their good intentions. There was a part that came up that helped the kid be more cautious when he ran across the street. So rather than trying to suppress them, they're finding better repair methods. You don't have to fear our cars to cross the street. There's a better way of self-soothing. So, first, you kind of have to convince the protectors to be willing to stop doing what they do, um, to stand by, to stand back. Usually during the therapeutic process, all of my parts start coming up. I have like these analyst parts that want to explain things, much as I'm doing now in this podcast. Um, Whereas we want to try to get at something that feels that feels shameful. Other analyst parts, and I have 16 of them, come up and say, "Oh, well, let's analyze the bond threat sequences in that way." And the therapist
16.
says, "Okay, okay, analyst parts, we're going to step aside. I'm going to ask you, are you willing to go into a little room where you observe what's happening, but don't comment yet. We're going to focus on the on the actual parts that are having the trouble." And you kind of have to have this respectful respectful conversation among the parts, keeps everyone's feeling secure and respected and recognized. And then you start getting at some of these deeper, deeper, level layer upon layer of manager and firefighter parts, and then eventually the exile parts. They start to unburden, but also there's this more of this process where you start to learn this kind of this inner self energy. This inner speaker becomes able to better mediate the bond threats among the parts. It's able to, when something shameful comes up, it's there to kind of address the shame feeling and say, yes, there's, even if no one outside in my outside world is going to rescue me and treat me nice, I've got a part that still respects myself and why I'm feeling this way, and is going to have a secure bond, and then we can figure out how to feel like that. And then all the protector parts can at least calm down and feel a little moment of peace where you can have a more reasonable feeling about, more reasonable way to express and feel your feelings. So you can internally start acknowledging the shame. The parts start to acknowledge the shame, why it's there, experience the feelings in a secure place. Um, and that helps reserve their original cause. Even as a child, all of a sudden, cars aren't scary. And then the it's easier to feel pride and solidarity amongst your inner parts, but also amongst other people in the outside world. So the kid who didn't know why he didn't want to learn to drive can now go learn to drive and feel happy with his friends and understand that, geez, there's some kid who was afraid of crossing the street, and that's why I couldn't learn to drive.
Hmm.
In a way, makes us feel scared, because I will, not just because you're here, but I had a nice, pretty happy, nurturing, loving childhood. But it's
Yeah.
surprising what little things happened when I was 4 years old or something. That just, it's like, oh, that's still there as a part. That's why I'm
Yeah.
acting the way I do. So it's
Yeah.
really kind of, in some ways it's scary, but at least there's a solution out there, and other therapies can get at that. But this one, I think the way it really respects the conversation makes it important. So just kind of in summary, the shame, I think this is a really nice way of building out this bond threat sequence, where I was talking about bond threat coming from social interaction, spoken words, real conversation. The idea is like, oh, your whole self is experiencing shame. And so I have to do something for my whole self to repair the bond with other people, either by restoring secure bonds with others or justifying my distance from others. And it's all or nothing. But um, but with IFS, we're complicating that. We're saying that there's also an internal family system that has internal management or mismanagement of parts. The bond thread is experienced. I experienced something embarrassing. The parts take it on, and some parts say, "No, this is an embarrassment. This is something that's bad about you and who I am." And so feel shame. Some parts really experience the shame deeply. Other parts manage those feelings, and they're all working things out. And maybe their solutions are sustaining poor internal bonds and therefore poor external bonds that never get repaired. But as you sometimes, if you're lucky enough to kind of mature on your own, you'll figure it out. The self becomes on its own more able to come up with better solutions. But therapy also helps find those internal and kind of balance those external bonds, and therefore the external bonds become that much more easy to repair.
Yeah.
So that's the goal. I'm gonna stop there because
Yeah, we really a good point to
yeah.
look forward to the Janice section and do that soon. But I would summarize my feelings on this. Great relief to
Mhm.
know that there's reasons why some external bonds are easier to have and sustain, and there's some others that never get they just never get resolved. And
Right.
those are the people we wish we had, and now with more explanation, say, well, I could have done better, and evening things out inside.
Hmm.
But it clearly points out to anyone who's looking at practice, and we say practice is mainly human behavior
Hmm.
with tools, and
Yeah.
we just say human, and that's supposed to cover everything.
Hmm.
It when you
One person.
uncover human, there's a lot going
Yeah.
on, and a lot of different versions of the human that are in there.
Right.
We're working on their sense of well-being. So
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
one.
So,
There's a
so
good one.
if you're a manager or a working group, you don't just have your 6 people with their job description and responsibilities. You
No.
have several hundred people
Yeah,
underneath each head.
exactly. Exactly. And you never know who's going to pop out. But I think that makes it even more exciting to know
Hmm.
that what we humans bring to the table. And so let's promise we'll take that next set of slides as an episode,
Yeah.
and we call that Janice.
Well, what I'm going to do next is kind of maybe explore what this self is that's being going from Mead's I and me to okay, there's lots of I me's within us. What is it? What is it really? And we can go. Um, one could go super esoteric, um, which and I don't. There are actually some IFS practitioners who go that way, and is probably reasons to go to do so. But I'm gonna maybe pull in some of our prior talks on brain and other things to say, well, before we jump to that level, what else is going on with the brain and what
Yeah.
we've already talked about that kind of show this much more complex picture of the person as externally built of and managing social relationships and talk as enacted social action, and internally doing social, basically this at least initially the same level of social conversational interaction amongst parts, but then kind of blending into something much that eventually becomes our neuronal groups feeling real feelings. And so how is, and in what sense is consciousness, our especially our subjective feeling of consciousness, all of this at once?
Let's do it.
All right, and I got the slide, so it won't take that long. Perhaps we'll find our next time.
Thank you, Dave. This really was so informative. A lot of deep thought, but it, told with pictures, which is very clever. Okay. Well, thank you again, folks. We'll see Dave very soon with more interesting things to say.